the point that we make in this paper is that effectively and quite bluntly, that's all very well, but if you can't do the thing, you can't actually execute the skill, having the best pre-performance routine and being able to control your breathing to get your body under control isn't going to be maybe as effective as it could be.
Welcome to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Howie Carson about long-term player development. I hope you enjoy. So now I'd like to move on to a book chapter that you authored titled Training for Success Under Stress, Appropriately Embedding Motor Skills in Sport. So earlier we talked about long-term technical training and now touching on performing and thriving under stress. So what were the elements you wanted to discuss and share here?
Sure. This is actually almost where I start a lot of my motor control lectures that I teach at the university. So at the start of the semester, there's a bit of a historical background to this paper because we're suggesting that something's been forgotten about. And so it's not surprising that it was apparent and prevalent in experiments and science many years ago. So to take you back, when you look at motor control research many, many years ago, during the 1930s, 40s, around about the time of First and Second World Wars, a lot of the research was driven to make a practical difference. So how can I get military personnel to put this machine gun together faster? How can I improve the capability of the pilots in the aircraft, for instance? So there was a very practical grounding in research. So there were lots of experiments, and you have to remember we didn't have the technology that we have now. So they would be investigating a particular type of stimulus. So if I get people to do this, what effect does it have on the outcome? Okay, so it was a stimulus response paradigm. So we did this with this group of people, that with that group of people, and these were the differences. And it was very much about improving outcomes. So it was very outcome-focused research. But then a lot of scientists in the field started to say, well, what we need to be able to do and what we should be looking at is the bit in the middle. So it's all very well providing a stimulus. So we're providing people with something else to do, and they're measuring the outcome. But what's being done with the information that we're giving them in that stimulus in order to cause the outcome? So what's the process involved? Okay. So what happened was a lot of scientists started to do a lot of process-focused research. So rather than trying to make a difference to people in the real world, they went into the laboratory. And this is where you may have heard of the paradigm information processing paradigm. So this is where we started to see a big boom in research that started to understand executive functioning. So things like memory, what it is that we do, how do we handle the information that's coming at us? Okay, so they started designing experiments in laboratories that were very simple, very unlike real-world tasks, but that they could manipulate very cleverly. And with those manipulations, they started to understand what was happening up here when you changed the conditions. Okay, so we had lots of research that was very good at understanding what we call fundamental or basic processes that we use to control movements. But they didn't tell us anything about the real world. So we saw a big shift in what a lot of scientists were doing was that they started to now look at real world performance. Okay, so they went out of the lab and decided to look at people in sporting situations, sporting circumstances. And this boom sort of happened in around about the 1980s. Okay, So you see the rise of more contextual theories, okay, about skill. And then we start to see all of these different factors popping up in the research that start to change the way that somebody performs under pressure. So now all of a sudden we're identifying that emotions are very important for performing under pressure. Now we start to understand that attentional control is very important for how somebody performs under pressure. Decision making is another one. Perception, so what information people identify within the environment when they're performing under pressure, that's really important. So we see all of these, we see this boom in factors, in research interest, in all of these subsystems that contribute to performance, and rightly so, they do contribute towards performance. And this has had big implications on professional practice. So a lot of golf coaches will train pre-performance routines, to try and handle nerves. They'll do things like arousal control exercises, maybe with biofeedback. So you have this whole menu of options in terms of trying to control yourself under pressure. And the point that we make in this paper is that effectively and quite bluntly, that's all very well, but if you can't do the thing, you can't actually execute the skill, having the best pre-performance routine and being able to control your breathing to get your body under control isn't going to be maybe as effective as it could be. So what we propose is that we need to go back to the time where we were looking at the execution of the skill, which was what was happening in those studies in the lab. Okay, so we're not saying we need to go back to the lab, but what we're saying is that we need to go back to coaches appreciating the execution process. So has a person got an effective execution process in their armory? Okay. So the title gives it away. So embedding technique, what we're talking about here is that, again, it's not one or the other. It's not should I do technical training or should I focus on emotional control, perception, decision making. It's actually about the decisions that a coach makes in order to appropriately embed good technique with all of those additional factors to make somebody competition ready.
I love that, because I said that many times. Say, hey, we're working on pre-shot routines, biofeedback, all these things, but I always emphasize, look, none of this is going to compensate for a terrible swing. I want to eliminate the mental errors. If you only have execution errors, I'm happy, because you're going to have execution errors. But that's kind of what you're saying here, is it's not one or the other, and by no means can even the perfect breathing strategy and best routine and visualization isn't going to matter if you can't fundamentally perform the skill. But going back and working on both, and just hearing you say that also kind of reminds me of what we talked about in terms of periodization and long-term planning, is managing all those elements. Because now we're starting, if you're listening to this, I think, wow, there's the technique, and you mentioned earlier, within the technique, is it learning a new skill? Is it redeveloping something, right? So there's all these different things you have to implement and manage. And that's where you need that long-term approach, basically.
Absolutely. And I would think of this as layers. So you're layering in components of training that will eventually lead to good performance. So if somebody's got a suboptimal technique that they need to work on, putting them under conditions of pressure isn't going to help them to change their technique in the first instance. Yeah? Will do at the very end of the process, when you want to build confidence in the player that they can do this execution under high anxiety. Absolutely. Yeah. but it's not very helpful to a player who's trying to understand the difference between what they think they're doing and what they need to be doing. It's about understanding the balance of processes that contribute towards performance. And in this chapter, we give an example in rugby where you can layer up the different components of performance to progressively test the player's skill. Okay? And I think that's useful as well in golf, because people are often interested in developing a new move, but then maybe they over-challenge themselves too early, and actually thinking about this as a progressive or systematic approach. In coaching years ago, good coaches still do. They talk about progressions. How can I progress the player on? Yeah, well, that takes planning. But I think a lot of players maybe think, well, I've had my lesson and I did it in the lesson, so now that's it. Yeah, I should now be able to do it on the golf course. But it doesn't work like that, because as soon as you add more things in, that's getting in the way of what you're trying to remember. Yeah,
absolutely.
So I've just had my lesson and I think I've got the knack of this, but of course you're not very experienced at it. So if I start throwing in awkward lies or bad weather conditions, or pretty much anything that wasn't the same as it was when you're on the driving range, you've got a high propensity to forget what you've just done. So it's about layering in until you get to the types of demand that you're trying to achieve at the end, your intention for impact. So that's what this chapter was saying, was that we've perhaps over-focused, and it's interesting, we go back to some work by Barbara Knapp in the 1960s, 1963. She wrote a book where she distinguished between what is called technique and skill. So technique is the mechanics of the movement. Okay, so there's golf technique, and you'll see in a lot of biomechanics texts, this is how you swing a club. This is the golf technique. But then skill is the application of that technique in a meaningful context. So there are lots of players with really good technique, but they're not very skillful. They can't apply that technique. And the application of the technique requires all of these additional things that we've just been speaking about. And what we're suggesting in this book chapter is that I think we've forgotten about the merits of good technique.
And you go in, I like this term, technique housekeeping. And can you touch on these 4 phases or 4 layers? I like that term, layers, a lot.
Yeah, sure. No problem. So, the first phase, if you can think of it, is as technique. So these are typically the fundamentals that somebody might be working on. Okay? So things like, alignment or posture or the length of the swing. Yeah? So what you're trying to do is to find the movement. It's basically, think of it as, movement competence. Yeah. So can I find the movement that I'm trying to achieve? So there's no pressure on. It's just a purely executional exercise. Okay. So you'll see people rehearsing or drilling movements. And you still see, even at the highest level of the game, that players will constantly return to fundamentals. Yeah, so they'll put alignment sticks down. Yeah, because they're constantly drilling those good behaviors. Okay, so it is quite simple, and most people should be able to do that. Okay, so I use a rugby passing example in a practical class that I have. Most people can turn 45 degrees with a rugby ball and then pass it in front of the person next to them. Okay, and then you just go up and down the line. Okay, it's not very difficult. But what you're doing is you're drawing attention to technical components that need to be done right. Okay, so the progression from being able to do the technique is skill with increasing pressure. And this puts the technique under conditions that require a lot more effort and for attention to be directed to more than one place. Okay, and this is where you'll start to see how well practiced the technique is. Okay, because as I said before, all of a sudden, if you start having to focus or pay attention or process other information, then what you need is for the technique to be executed in a more automatic way. Yeah, but if it's not very well established, then you'll start to see those errors creeping in. Okay, so what you might do in the rugby example, we incorporate a number of components that make the task more difficult. Okay, so going up and down the line drill, moving forwards and backwards. Okay, so that's something that you would expect in rugby because the line moves up and down the pitch. Okay.
So going on the golf course would be something similar to that. There's a bit more pressure.
I would say that was probably too far. So what you might do is you might implement an adaptation to the skill. Okay, so you might go from a ball on the tee to a ball on the ground, yeah, or a different type of shot. So you're still working on the fundamentals to get them right, but what you're doing is you're now introducing a progression in the technique that the person all of a sudden go, oh, hang on, this is different. I got to think about this. Yeah. Now the next phase, which is skill in context. So this is going on the golf course. Yeah. So now, okay, I can do this. I can do the technique like this, and I can do the technique like that. Now, can I progress it to be able to do the technique with more real world like challenges? Okay. So as you progress to this stage, you're now putting a demand on their ability to select the right shot, yeah, to deal with different distances of the skill. Yeah, it becomes a bit harder. And with each of these phases, by the way, you can conceptualize this as having a different intention for impact. And the player needs to realize, so at this stage, this is the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. So once you've then implemented the skill in context, we then have the final stage, which is the
representative practice.
Representative practice, yeah. And this is the type of practice that a lot of skill-based theories are trying to promote. So we're not saying that doing representative practice is bad. Yeah. So a lot of the sort of constraints-led ecological theories are saying that, you know, you should practice under conditions that mimic as close as possible the demands of the real world thing, because that's how the movements are organized, based on the richness of information in the real event. But often you find if you put somebody in that situation, that they can't do the movements. Yeah, it's not a matter of them just organizing into an effective solution. That doesn't happen a lot of the time. Hence why the progressive approach helps somebody build the movement competence, but also the confidence once they experience those types of challenges. Yeah. Otherwise, they just give up because I can't do it. Yeah. Golf's too hard. But if golf was presented as a series of progressions and achievements, people would be not only more motivated to keep up with their golf. Yeah. I mean, you see this with like 9-hole courses. Great for beginners, because they're now tackling a task that's appropriate for their movement competence. Yeah, they're not daunted by standing on a tee that's 400 yards away from the green, thinking it's going to take me 6 shots to get there, and it says 4 on the card. Yeah, this is where we're getting. So the representative practice is what you would experience in the real deal. And so, that will have a number of different processes involved to achieve that performance. But our point is that unless the person is able to execute, all of those additional processes won't be implemented in an optimal way. Okay, so we're not saying, we're very much supporting that there are multiple strategies. Of course, there are multiple strategies to improving performance under pressure, but that coaching and certainly skill acquisition theory seems to have forgotten the ability to do the thing, to do the movement. So that's why we're stressing this appropriate and embedding approach. So what might be quite a good idea for coaches, and again going back to this idea of macro, meso, and micro from the previous paper that Stephen Orr did, is maybe just to start thinking about the outcomes that you're trying to achieve with, even if just start with a client. So a golfer who is sufficiently motivated to play golf, but is looking for improvements, start thinking, quite rationally about, okay, so what are the challenges that they face? And then how can I be very creative with my planning and design of training for that player to encourage them to develop the sorts of abilities that they'll need to eventually be able to perform as they want to. And actually, I think when you talk to golfers in this type of way, they are motivated and they are inspired by the prospect of improving all of these skills that they didn't know that they even had or used. Emotional control, that's actually quite good for other things other than golf. Decision making, that's a useful one as well. So it's not just about improving somebody's golf performance, but if they can see how these skills are useful, or they start to use them as well and practice them in other aspects of their life, you can start to improve somebody's life through golf. So again, it's the beauty of this interdisciplinarity. It's not just the technique, it's not just the psychological skills, and it's not just having fun, and the social side of things. Actually, it's about how do you integrate the sorts of outcomes across all three of those dimensions to enhance the learning experience for that particular client. And the balance of those factors will change depending on so many things. Who the golfer is, how long they have to develop, their previous coaching, any physical limitations.
It's back to this psychosocial.
It's exactly, and that's where I suppose, again, the advantages or the richness of this biopsychosocial comes in, is that you actually get to understand your client. You need to understand who they are in order to be able to offer them good advice for them.
And what stands out to me is with this technique, skill with increasing pressure, skill in context, representative practice, implementing those things by definition almost requires some sort of planning. It's hard to really do that in an effective way if you're not, which goes back to the previous paper we talked about, if you're not having some sort of more macro mesocycles in place addressing these things. So I think they go hand in hand, that you need them. And the more I listen to you speak, the more aware I'm becoming of the importance of planning and setting out a plan, sharing it with the player, but at least for you knowing what is the vision of this player. Because otherwise, if you're just doing representative practice, but they're in a phase where they're still trying to really learn a new technique, there's just a misalignment.
You see so many potentials for a golfer to get confused or to start going down a rabbit hole, not literally a rabbit hole on the golf course, but a rabbit hole in their mind, in terms of what they think they should be doing. As a coach, you might give a good golf lesson on the training ground, and the golfer demonstrates improvement, and they're starting to understand or acquire the movement that they want to do. But then they'll go and play golf with their friends and experience a whole range of different conditions, and then start trying to tweak and think of what went wrong. When it's the conditions that are driving the person's thought processes in potentially a very unhelpful way, because a performer of that ability and experience won't know what is good for them overall. Yeah, they haven't got the knowledge that you have as a golf coach to be able to say, oh, this is cause and effect. You know, that error happens because this was a principle in the swing, you know, that went wrong. Mm-hmm. And they start to confuse themselves, and then it's just...
And there's doubt, and then they're second-guessing, and then goes back to hopping around, trying to find some sort of quick solution, and it becomes a very vicious cycle.
But then what they think they're doing isn't the same as what they are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So this is, we call this skill housekeeping.
Yeah.
So getting your movements in order, putting the things away that you don't want, and just keeping out the things that you do want.
Yeah, I love
so this
that.
is a good exercise to be able to, I suppose, initiate that process, but also to test that what is locked away actually is locked away, and what's out for show is what's going to competition.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Coach Noah Talks, powered by Integrity Golf Performance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to the Golf Performance newsletter. This is where I share written, audio, and video content designed to help golfers take their game to the next level. All the relevant links from today's episode and to the newsletter can be found below. See you next time.